Hello and welcome to Westchester Dateline, the news talk show program that offers in-depth interviews with prominent people in the news. I'm your host, Dennis Rudin. My special guest this evening is our new congressman from the 20th CD, Joseph DioGuardi.
Good to see you, Dennis. Fine, yes.
Congratulations on winning the seat in the 20th CD. I take it you've been very active since the transition period. Could you fill us in a little bit and tell us what committees you've been assigned to, and what do you think some of the priorities are now that are taking place in Congress?
Two committee assignments, Dennis. One is the Government Operations Committee, which is a kind of a giant oversight committee over other government agencies. And I think that's going to be a good committee for me to be on as a certified public accountant. And I've got two subcommittee assignments under that. One is the Oversight Committee, and the other one is what they call Government Information. Another committee assignment is Small Business. And again, with my business background, I think that'll be a good one to be on.
Okay, fine. Could you give our audience just a brief insight? I mean, how has your life changed, your family, from being, well, I wouldn't say that someone who's a candidate lives a typical everyday life, but what are some of the adjustments that take place in a person's life when they have to shift gear from public candidate to setting up the congressional office and making it work?
Well, we're still in the middle of the transition. It's like I hadn't finished the campaign at this point. There are many things that have to be done to get started in serving the public. Opening up offices in Washington and in the district, hiring people, and setting up systems. And we're in the process of, I guess we're in the final phases of doing that. So you've got the need to start up, so to speak, because you just don't walk into an office that's already set up, especially when the office changes parties. And at the same time, the phones keep ringing and the mail keeps coming in, and the public doesn't take a vacation because the congressman's change.
Right.
So there's been a lot of pressure. I think the most important part of what I've been able to do in these last 2 months or so is not only the orientation of learning more about the key issues locally and on the national scene, and there have been quite a few good seminars for that, but hiring good people. A congressman will not do an effective job unless he has people who really know what they're doing, both in Washington and here. And I used, I guess, my business background to decide that the most important thing I could do in the first 2 months was to identify the most experienced, competent, and, of course, loyal people I could find. And you probably know that I've hired them from all different parties, Republican, Conservative, and Democratic. But I have an excellent team of people now, both in Washington and in the district, with experience.
Right. That's comforting to know. There were many issues, of course, raised during the campaign. One of them that stands out in my mind at this moment is you spoke about the need for urban enterprise zones. You had seen it in Connecticut, and you said, and due to the budget cuts, I think we're going to have to come up with certain kinds of creative ways to handle that. Have you had a chance to implement this idea? Or what stage are you at now?
Well, it's interesting you raised that now, because we didn't hear about it too much since the campaign, but yet President Reagan addressed the issue in his inaugural speech. I'm still very much supportive of the concept of urban enterprise zones, and hopefully this will be reintroduced. As you know, it was held up in the Democratic House, controlled House, and it's got to be something that should come back on the agenda. I'm sure it will, and the President, by mentioning it in the inaugural speech, I think has given it a new level of visibility. They are around us. There's one in Norwalk, Connecticut, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Baltimore, Maryland. These are enterprise zones that were formed under state law. What we're looking for now is a federal law to also add federal tax incentives to the incentives that exist under these zones in those states. Even if for some reason the concept does not get by from the federal point of view, there's no reason why we shouldn't do it from a state and local point of view.
Could you just review very briefly the concept for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. Basically, it's to attract private capital in a deteriorating area. Take, for instance, a section of, let's say, Mount Vernon, where the stores are boarded up, buildings are boarded up, maybe the city owns some of this property. There's a need for private capital to come in to rebuild this area, to create new retail markets, get people to live there again, even though they might be commuting outside the district. And the idea is to create a package of incentives, beginning with, if we're talking about the federal program, income tax incentives, maybe investment credits, at least under the current tax law to do this, and then have that reflected also in the state income tax, and then let's say a sales tax provision that would say that if you shopped in that area, your sales taxes would be even lower. And other kinds of subsidies. For instance, Mount Vernon might agree to some tax abatement for the individual who risked the capital to build something for a period of years. So when you look at this package of incentives, you get construction going, that creates jobs. You get retail business in the area. You get, hopefully, residential construction going as well, so that people move there. And what happens is the experience, and there are many of these around the country, over 100, what happens is that it's like a hub, and you begin to see, rather than deterioration, people start to build on that initial project that started off as an urban enterprise zone.
Can the federal government do this by themselves, or will they need the help of big business? Is there a vehicle how big business can get involved?
You don't necessarily need just big business, but you do need the business sector. You know, the backbone of this country still remains, still is the small business sector. And small business is not small potatoes. You have a lot of closely held companies that have hundreds of millions of dollars of sales. But you do need the help of the business sector to make the investments because of the lack of funding that's now available both at the state and the federal level.
Right.
I could see some seed money coming in from those sources, but the investments have to be made by the private sector.
You happen to be in a unique situation, and I think it's probably a good situation for you. You have many friends in the business world, basically big business. When I had served on the committee, on the county committee, to identify the problems with housing, which we'll go into a little later, one of the problems that we hit was the fact that although the corporations will ship in big executives and provide homes for them, there's nothing being done for middle management people here. And with rents so expensive, there's a tendency for young people between, once they graduate college, I guess 22 and 35, to not look so much to New York and to look to other areas. Do you see a possibility where, due to your strong business connections, you may be able to sit down with some of the corporate heads and maybe convince them that it would be economically feasible for them to not only, you know, try to keep good people here and to create more jobs in the middle management sector by helping out with the county problem with housing?
Well, you've hit the key problem. It's affordable rental housing in the county, whether it's middle management or seniors. I met with a group of senior citizens today, and we're talking about a project in Mamaroneck. There's no question that I can sit down with corporations one-on-one and would feel comfortable in doing so, and probably will at one point do that. My initial approach will be to the chambers of commerce. I've already addressed the presidents of all the chambers in Westchester County at one of their monthly meetings last month, and have made separate presentations to the chamber in the chambers in New Rochelle and in Mount Vernon.
What can they do?
Well, the chambers are interesting because, to me, they represent probably the best bridge or lightning rod to bring together the public sector and the private sector. A chamber, as you know, is a nonprofit organization, so it's not political, it's not governmental, and in a sense it's not a business enterprise because it's trying to be an association of business for good in a particular community. My feeling is that the chambers should be the catalyst to bring together the elected officials, the business community, and the community leaders. And I mentioned this in the campaign. We did this when I was with my former accounting firm. We worked with a very large city in the West where the Chamber took the lead role in bringing together those sectors of the community to form a vision or to crystallize a plan for where they wanted that city to go in the next 5 to 7 years. Dennis, I don't see enough planning being done in municipalities, and that's very important. But planning should be done by and with the people that are going to be affected by that planning. That's why it's important to divine leadership to include those three groups. So I see the chambers as a place that I will to reach out to. In fact, we're working up a schedule now so that I will meet with, in the near future, the boards of the each one of the jurisdictions to give them this message that we must get them to be more proactive in getting the planning process. And then once we get the planning done and agreed to, then we go to implementation. And then the businesses that are represented on that have been made part of the planning process will more likely then make a contribution to the implementation. And I'd be delighted to sit down one-on-one with the major companies in this district, and we have some great companies in this district, as you know, to the need for them to participate and maybe with some sweat equity as well in this process. Just to give you, for instance, I'm not only just talking about this, the campaign's over. I'm trying to make some of this happen. Okay, I'm glad.
Promises.
But I've already met with Mayor Blackwood a week after his election. I figure that Mount Vernon is very close to the top of my list on where this has to happen, economic development. So I met with Mayor Blackwood and found that that's at the top of his list as well. And he has a good business background himself. We have a date next Saturday morning where he and I and a few others from my staff and his are going to tour Mount Vernon to see where we can identify areas that might be attractive to private capital. The problem's this. I can't bring in, and by the way, I'm going to try to bring a couple of developers with me that I know are operating already in the county, people that I know, for themselves what's happening. The problem is you can't expect a businessman to fix, let's say, a building or a particular section of a street if they feel that the area is going to continue to deteriorate.
Great.
So what the businessman needs to know is that there is a support for a particular area so that if the money's invested, there'll be a feeling that it'll continue to grow. And we need to identify an area that if I attract a businessman to, let's say, rehab a building or restore some commercial areas, that the city is going to consistently attract more people, more capital to it, so it will continue to grow. We can't have something being done isolated so that it just disappears. It will be a bad precedent for other businessmen to come into. So this is what I'm trying to do. And in fact, Saturday, we're going to take a tour to see where we can find those areas so I can hopefully attract a developer to begin working with Mayor Blackwood and the representatives of that community.
One of the problems that you may find, because I've seen this in my activities, with all due respect to the chambers, usually some of the biggest cities may be more sophisticated, but what happens if you work with the chamber and they don't have, paid personnel, or the person that's the president is just not that sophisticated? Can you bring any help, support from your office to help them put together some of these concepts? And how about a place like Yonkers where, there's not much there? I mean, maybe you tell me if I'm wrong, my perception of how you would handle it, but your help is going to have to come from outside. What's there in the city to actually work with?
Well, there are businessmen in Yonkers right now that I think would join the effort, but you said if the chamber doesn't have the resources,
right?
That's the reason to get the business sector more involved with the chamber, because then they could make available. That's the sweat equity I was talking about, so to speak. Okay. If not financial resources, initially they could lend, hopefully, 1 or 2 people. And this could be a rotating assignment from corporations, so that there is help, executive help given. Certainly, from my office, I will make time available to make sure that the process gets off in the right direction. And at this very point, I'm trying to get the partner in charge of the project that I spoke about on the West Coast in my former firm to address a meeting of all the presidents of the chambers in the county. I mentioned this and they liked the idea. In fact, I've had one conversation with an individual. He likes the idea, and I want to get this process going.
Very good. We have to pause. We'll be right back after this message.
For over 100 years, the Red Cross has always been there, in emergencies when America needed us most, with a hot meal, a warm, dry place to stay, and a helping hand. But without your time and money, there would be no Red Cross. And where would America be without the Red Cross?
For those of you who just joined us, we're talking with Congressman Joe DioGuardi. Joe, welcome back. As many of people probably know, you're a new congressman in the 20th CD. So, of course, we've been getting into the challenges that you now face. We're talking about the urban enterprise zones and the challenge of bringing jobs into the community. By the way, we forgot to mention, you opened up new offices, right? You have a phone number, an address, people need to get in touch with you?
Yes.
Where do they call you?
Well, our first office is opened up in White Plains now, and the number there is 997-6440, and that's at 1 North Broadway. The other office right now is in Washington, D.C.
Okay, fine. Now, getting back to the subject at hand, you know, mixed in with the urban enterprise zones, of course, is the federal budget. There has been a lot of talk, a lot of controversy about it, you know, some people feel that the president is cutting too close to the bone. A couple of Republicans have felt, and I'll name them in a moment, that the priorities are not being spread across the board fairly. Governor, I believe Tom Kean, Republican Governor Tom Kean from New Jersey, had mentioned that he was upset. In theory, he believed in the budget cuts, but that he felt that New York was not getting a fair treatment in, like, mass transit. He felt that other things that were happening in Texas, granted they don't have as large a system as we do, but they weren't suffering the same kind of cutbacks as other areas around the country. What is your view on this?
Yeah, my view is that we're going to have to get a lot better balance between the domestic cuts and the military cuts before you will see the budget pass. There is great sentiment as I walk around the halls of Congress for making sure that there's parity between those areas. We need a strong military, there's no doubt about that. But we don't need a military that is spendthrift, as I said during my campaign. I'm still not convinced that there is not a lot of waste in the military. I mentioned before that only 6% of the procurement contracts in the military are competitively bid. Only 6%. That means 94% are what they call sole source, privately arranged deals. And there's no business that could stand that lack of price competition. And we've had another recent development with the $700 toilet seat. I'm sure that you heard that one. So we have now the $7,000 coffee maker, the $500 hammer, and the $700 toilet seat. I would say that you know, I hope these are the exception rather than the rule. But I'm delighted now to be on the Government Operations Committee, which has as its jurisdiction all government agencies, and procurement will be directly related to that. I'm sad to say that the first meeting that we had of the oversight subcommittee of that, of which I'm a member, the recommendations of the Grace Commission were brought up so that committee would take jurisdiction for them. And I was delighted, being a certified public accountant. I felt I was on the right committee, and now this would be an easy, overwhelming vote to now look at the recommendations of the Grace Committee. And I was just shocked to find the chairman, the Democratic chairman, because these are all controlled by Democrats, as you know, decide that since this was President Reagan's commission, let him adopt the commission before we look into it. And what happened was then, incredibly, a partisan vote. All the Democrats voted against looking at the commission's recommendations, and all the Republicans voted for them. And it just shocked me. Now, maybe I'm naive about these things. But what I did is I then had a discussion with Jack Anderson of the Washington Post about it, because I had met Jack a couple of weeks earlier, and I'm going to continue to push for these recommendations, and maybe not all the recommendations are good, but why not look at the ones that seem to be agreeable to most people and bring them up before these committees. I'm happy to say that because of my discussions with Jack Anderson and the fact that I'm only the third certified public accountant to be elected to Congress, he has now put me on the board with Peter Grace and himself on Citizens Against Waste, which is the nonprofit organization that will follow up the Grace Commission. So I will make this area of waste a #1 area for myself, and if I can't be heard as a freshman minority congressman, you will hear about me in the press, because I will ask the questions as someone who has spent 22 years with one of the world's major accounting firms, 12 years as a partner in this area, and as a CPA. So I feel good about this assignment, but I think it's important to get these recommendations before the committees in Congress so that we not only read about these recommendations, we begin to implement some of them. Getting back to the budget deficit and your question, I think we've got to look very heavily and very carefully at the military budget to see what we can cut out in terms of waste. I don't want to cut out the heart of any programs that we need for our defense. And before that budget is adopted, you will see parity between the two areas. We can't balance the books in this country on less than 20% of the budget, which is what's being proposed here. And the other thing we have to recognize, look at what Paul Volcker said, unless we cut this deficit by at least $50 billion, there's not going to be any credibility. We're talking about a $200 billion annual budget deficit. And what we're trying to do is come up with just a $50 billion decrease. Say just, it's a lot of money. But $200 billion is much worse than $150 billion. The answer here is to make sure we balance our books at some point. But the markets, the credit markets, are not going to believe anybody's for real in this unless we come up with at least $50 billion this year. And if they don't believe that, you won't see interest rates come down. And if interest rates don't come down, you're not going to see the economic development and the housing that we need. So we've got a window of opportunity right now, with the country growing, as it is, to now bite the bullet a little bit and get that $50 billion under our belt, cut it back, but balance it between domestic cuts and military cuts. And I believe my formula, which says to freeze domestic spending, not to cut out 60% of transportation, but to freeze it, and then to freeze military spending with perhaps maybe an increase just for inflation, 4.7%, not 13% is what's being requested. And then leave Social Security alone with the COLAs.
I wanted to ask
because I don't want to see any more people put into the
citizens.
poverty level. And senior citizens depend on, the prices for prescriptions is very high. Medicare is not covering all the costs of medical help. So if we now play games with the Social Security and in the COLAs, what we're going to do is we're going to see more people put below the poverty line. I don't want to see that happen. If we leave that alone, if we freeze military spending, max maybe 4.7% inflation or whatever the inflation rate is, and freeze domestic, you come up with $50 billion. That's the formula, I think, that's the formula certainly I'm supporting, and I think that's the formula that you'll see more congressmen on a bipartisan basis looking at before you see a budget pass.
Some of the other cuts, and how can you justify, granted, someone who makes $30,000 may not be below the poverty line, especially if they're single, but if they have a family, they have a mortgage to pay. And if they have 2 kids in college, and you take away those college loans, how are they going to make it?
Yeah, it'd be extremely difficult, and that's why...
How do you see, about those cuts?
Well, I think what we have to do there is look at the way we've enforced those programs in the past. One of the problems that we've had is that people who have been lent this money in the past, and I understand the numbers like $8 billion worth of loans that have not yet been repaid, they're making it bad for others who now need that money. What we have to do is recycle this money. This money was not given as a grant, as you know, Dennis. It was lent.
Sure.
And government shouldn't be in the banking business, by the way. And I think when those loans were made, they probably should have been made with maybe a little bit more security or collateral. Maybe the family should have been involved, because the intention was to pay them back. And they weren't paid back. So I think we've got to enforce that, because the public good demands that that money be available to others. Now, don't forget, we're funding people who are getting a college education. These are people not in the poverty. When they come out of college, they hopefully will get a good job. Their first priority should be to pay back the loan. so that we can now return the courtesy
But if
to
you
others.
take away the loans, they won't reach that step.
There is no doubt that we're not going to, as far as I'm concerned, we cannot take away the loans. Educating our children is probably the most important thing that we can do. And making education available to as many people is the most important thing I can think about to future generations. So the key here is not to cut those programs out, it's to make them work better. It's to look under the numbers, to see how they can be managed better, how they can be made more efficient. And that's what I'll be looking at.
But are you going to vote for these cuts that President Reagan is proposing?
As I said before, my overall program is a freeze, not to cut.
So basically what you're saying is there are Republicans in Congress who feel that if there is danger in their district, they will not follow the president on all of his programs.
I would say the district is a consideration, but just using common sense is probably a better consideration, that those are programs that are needed. And instead of emasculating the programs, for instance, cutting 60% out of mass transportation would be lunacy in this district.
Catastrophic to the system.
People have to get to work, and usually it's the poor people on mass transportation and the elderly. So you really can't do that. But let's freeze it, and let's re-examine it to see how we can make it work better. And where things are not working right, maybe those things have to be cut out, but not where they impact people who really need these programs.
Thank you, Joe, very much for coming on Westchester Dateline. My guest has been our new congressman in the 20th CD, Joe DioGuardi. This is Dennis Rudin for Westchester Dateline. Good evening. Hello and welcome to Westchester Dateline, the news talk show program that offers in-depth interviews with prominent people in the news. I'm your host, Dennis Rudin. My guest this evening is Congressman Joe DioGuardi. Joe, welcome back to our show.
Good to see you again, Dennis. Nice to be here.
Joe, the last time you were here, we basically spoke about problems in the district. We'll try to hit on some of those, but I want to get into foreign policy now because there are many big things happening in Washington that affect Westchester County. One of the biggest debates going on is the Star Wars system. And I'm not sure from the news reports that we get whether we're talking about fiction versus reality. President Reagan has said that this system will end, the possibility of future warfare. The big question is, and I have not seen credible proof of this, maybe you have, what scientists are backing his statements? Is Star Wars feasible? Is it credible? Is government credible, or are we dealing just with myths and hopeful dreams?
Yeah. I think it's too early to tell. We're talking about something that's in the research stage at this time. People call it Star Wars, which really has come to be a pejorative statement. It's the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative. And I support it. The President, as you know, supports it heavily in his inaugural address. He made a major point on that, and Margaret Thatcher also came behind the President on that. I think, again, we got to look at this in terms of our strengths. It's been demonstrated over the years that our strength vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, in military matters especially, is our technological strength. It's acknowledged they have many more missiles than we do. In fact, some say they have as many as 3 times the number of missiles that we do. But they're not as accurate as ours. That's why we see them trying to steal our computers. And we've got to be very careful that the Customs Service enforces these things. We can't export our technology to Russia. What I think the President is saying here, and we've all got to find out more about this, because I think there are scientists on both sides of it. I think what he's saying is that we need to develop a system that will enable us both to walk away, both sides to walk away from nuclear weapons. And what he sees here is an opportunity to develop a system. I couldn't tell you whether it's going to work. I don't think anyone at this point can say that.
Have you or any members of Congress, have they set up any congressional committees to talk with the scientific community to find out if there is any credibility behind this system?
Yeah.
And don't you think they should, considering the fact that we are asking people to sacrifice in many areas in the budget? Let's be sure if they sacrifice that it's going to do something.
Yeah, there are meetings going on, I'm sure. I'm not on the Armed Services Committee. I haven't been exposed to those meetings, but there will be briefings that I will attend on the issue. I think the thing that we've got to look at here again is what will it take to let the Russians know that we've now got a system that's the ultimate deterrent? What will it take to tell them that, you know, if you're going to keep stockpiling these nuclear weapons, they're worthless because they can be knocked out? I'm not saying that we deploy such a system. I think we've got to separate that. All I'm saying now is that we don't give up on the research. Now, maybe we have to look at the amount of research that's being done. I've heard some extraordinary numbers, and I've got to look into these numbers, and that'll be part of what I want to know more about. But I think we've got to continue. It's what got them back to the talking table.
But, I mean, you will be pursuing this farther?
No question about it.
Either via a congressional committee, if not yourself, to find out whether there is credibility or not. Because the statements that we seem to hear is the President talks one way, and there are actual questions as to the authenticity of whether the system can be what it's supposed to be. And although, like you say, you don't know, the commitment for the money has been made, right?
Well, research, again.
Right.
And I would never suggest that we deploy such a system until we sat down with the Russians to say, now here we've got a system, why don't we both expend the money to deploy it? Because now you'll know you can knock out my weapons, and I know I can knock out yours. It's probably the best way to have what you would call on-site inspections, which we talked about. I mean, everybody wants a nuclear freeze, and certainly I would like to see nuclear weapons disappear. But we can't do that if we know that the other side will have an advantage. At the same time, we don't want to be building any more of these. So we've got to find the quintessential defensive weapon that would say, now they're useless. And I hope this will lead to that. I think it's too early to tell. Now, you might say, well, how can we expend this kind of money at a time when we have the budget deficit? Again, I think we've got to look at our priorities. The Russians are now talking to us. Most people recognize that the reason they're talking to us is the fact that we have decided to go ahead to research this system. If there's anything that they fear, it's our technological ability, because we could make obsolete all the monies that they've invested in those weapons. So it's to their interest now to come back and talk to us. But does that mean that we go through every weapon system that everyone comes up with? No. I'm on record as being against MX, and I made that point in the campaign. It's an unusual position for someone coming from my party to be in, but I believe that that weapon is not a common sense weapon. It has 10 warheads. It's in a fixed hardened silo, very expensive. It's viewed by the other side as destabilizing. It looks like a first strike weapon as opposed to a defensive weapon, and it might very well invite the response it's trying to avoid, because we know the Russians have silo-busting missiles right now. that could be sent after it. So I say, well, maybe what we ought to be doing is, again, looking at our technological strength. What's the next system on the drawing board? It's called Midget Man, which is a mobile system, one warhead, much less destabilizing, much less vulnerable, and common sense would dictate, and I'm not a military expert, that maybe that's where we should be putting our money. And if we invest billions of dollars in MX right now, we're going to have Midget Man anyway. The generals will have both systems. So I say, listen, we're strong enough now to maybe bolster that Trident fleet. It maybe doesn't give us the perfect triad that everyone is looking for, but I think we can get by and accelerate some of this technology on Midget Man. Otherwise, you're going to have both. And certainly, go ahead with the research on Star Wars. I hesitate to use that word, Strategic Defense Initiative, to see where it gets us. And if we see something that's for real, then sit down with the other side to see that we can both share it.
This foreign policy, you probably read last week about the Westmoreland trial coming to a conclusion. I don't want to get into the Vietnam controversy, that's behind. But the point that I wanted to bring out looking at that is, how can we check to make sure that government is credible with the people? You had a situation, and it did come out, that the press in certain instances wasn't as accurate as they could have been with the reporting. But it also came out the clear truth that the numbers were fudged of the casualties in Vietnam, and you had a situation where, even though he was a Democrat, you had a president who desperately believed in the military, who wanted to do what was right, was not told the truth. The country was brought down, the president was brought down. Is there any way to set up a network where we can check, not only on defense, but areas, you know, of government where what they're telling us is really credible? It's more pertinent in defense, I think, because you're dealing with lives, and not just lives now, but the total life of society and civilization as we know it.
Are you suggesting that we have certified public accountants review the numbers? Maybe we need more of those. They said in one of my prior programs, it's incredible that there are only 3 certified public accountants in Congress.
And you mentioned about your committee with Ralph Anderson?
Well, Jack Anderson, the columnist, and Peter Grace, Citizens Against Waste.
In that particular issue, but the same thing can happen in government again, you know, as we approach areas like Nicaragua, and I believe there is the talk of possibly having to reinstate the draft due to the fact that the population is on the decline. We haven't made any commitments yet, but I believe that is being studied, correct?
I've heard about it. I've not been involved. I think you're talking about the issue of credibility and integrity. Certainly, we've got to expect integrity from the people that we look up to, elected officials, and in every respect from the military leaders themselves. Now, there is a series of checks and balances, because congressional hearings should get at the root of figures that might be in dispute, certainly figures that are being relied upon to either escalate a military matter or not. Now, what happened during that phase, I don't know, but I think the hearing, or the Westmoreland trial, was good in the sense that it gave the public the notion that maybe certain things have to be questioned and shouldn't be relied on their surface. Because I think you could assume with the trial that I was kind of disappointed in a sense that the trial was just cut off because it left me with the feeling that there were things that the public should not know, in effect. And I mean, I'm not saying that either side was right or wrong, but it appeared as though it wasn't to the interests of the parties to continue, or maybe one party, because of other information that would be coming out at this time. So maybe Congress has got to stay very close to what's happening and have hearings to be sure that we're getting the right numbers before other appropriations are made. Don't forget, Congress doesn't manage the system. I've been in Congress now a couple of months, and we talk about authorizing things, appropriating things. We talk about what we spent last year, what we should add on this year, but I never hear the word management discussed. I mean, I come out of business. The key element in my world is, how are we managing the system?
Is
it working?
Manageable?
Well, I hope so. I know there are a lot of people that have taken management responsibility for it, but Congress is not the managing arm. I would like to see Congress, though, get more into that by getting underneath the numbers. We tend to be caught up in Congress looking at the numbers superficially, quantitatively. I'd like to see some qualitative analysis on what's being managed well, what's not being managed well, and really get a good feel for that before we do further authorizing and further appropriating. And that's one of the things I'll be mentioning more and more. Maybe my background is the right one to have at this point, because I'll be able to ask the right questions.
As we look around the world at the hot spots, do you see a situation where we should be aggressive, or should we step back and kind of recoil and look and see what's happening around the world? Basically, Nicaragua, other spots where, governments that we don't necessarily support are in power. Because in Vietnam, I mean, there is a fundamental problem. Communism seems to do very well in countries that are very poor. They need a certain amount of sophistication to be able to adapt to capitalism. If you support governments and just overthrow the regime that's there, are we going to get the results that we really want, that we'll be happy with?
We've got to be very careful, and we've got to learn from the past. We've got to be careful that in trying to overcome left-wing governments, we don't end up with right-wing dictatorships. And I think this is the lesson that we've learned, perhaps in other South American countries, and we've got to be vigilant that that doesn't happen. At the same time, we can't walk away from the challenge and our moral responsibility to foster the democratic process where it is in a seedling stage in the world. And I believe that one of the good recent examples is what happened in El Salvador with DioGuardi. No one says that he's perfect, but we've got now a government that's in the fledgling stage, democratic fledgling stage, where many of the human rights and civil rights atrocities of the past have been uncovered. And I understand that some of this still goes on, but nowhere near where it was before. And I think there we've got to be ready to help with certainly economic aid. Dennis, the biggest problems in these areas, as you mentioned, alluded to, is economic. And we've got to somehow help these nations help themselves. And anything that we can do to help them bolster their economies, I think is going to be the best deterrent from a communistic regime coming in, because communism seems to thrive on the bellies of hungry people. So we've got to somehow do in these foreign countries what we try to do here, and that's provide jobs and provide economic expertise. At the same time, we've got to balance that against the military problem that we have. And just take Nicaragua. One of the free seminars I attended was in Miami, where we spent 2 days looking at the issue of Central America. And it was interesting to be there, because when you looked at a map and you saw Miami, you saw how close it was to Nicaragua. I mean, geopolitics of that area. Sure. This is all very close to the United States. But I was happy to be there because I wanted a better insight into what was happening. And one of the things that we have to fear the most is that the Soviets are not using this as an opportunity to get now a base on the Pacific. They already have Cuba. I mean, what's going to happen now if they get something in Nicaragua? So we've got to balance the need to stabilize these countries economically, to keep them away from left-wing revolutionary governments, but we've got to look at also the area of the Soviet influence.
Okay, we will be right back after this message.
That's me, Lanny Basham, receiving a gold medal in international rifle shooting at the 76 Olympic Games. I'm a member of the U.S. Army Reserve, along with the thousands of men and women who served with me. I salute America's athletes competing in the 84 Games in Los Angeles. Going for the gold, they push themselves to new limits. Their dedication, spirit, and sense of fair play make us all proud to be Americans.
A public service message from this station and the Army Reserve.
My guest is Congressman Joe DioGuardi, for those of you who have just joined us. We've been talking about foreign policy, about the Star Wars, about the hotspots in the world. Is there anything that we left out? Israel, the Middle East, do you want to make some comments on those areas?
Oh, I think there are a number of areas that we have to continue our vigilance on, and I think Israel is one. In that area of the world, as you know, it's really our only true friend. It's the only democratic nation there. And the key now with Israel is economic aid. I was in Israel even before I thought about running for Congress. I went there as a partner of the accounting firm I was in, Arthur Anderson. As a matter of fact, I was invited by the Minister of the Economy, Yaakov Meridor, because of the ideas that I had given him on a trip here about dealing with the economic problems in Israel. And the bottom line of my philosophy for Israel is that military security for Israel is an illusion without economic security. And we've got to, as I said there in the speech that I gave in the Knesset building itself to some of the ministers, is that my vision for Israel is to make the shekel as strong as the dollar. And how do you do that? Well, you've got to deal with the economic problems. They've got a terrific inflation there that they've institutionalized. And while it works there because it's indexed, it prevents people from bringing in hard currency to the country. Now, one of Israel's greatest strengths is its brain power. It's not gold, it's not oil, it's 7,000 PhDs. That country could literally be the licensor to the world, but it needs hard currency to continue the research. And I came up with a couple of ideas on how partnerships could be arranged to continue that research, partnerships between investors here in the United States and the Israeli government. I'm going to be spending my time for Israel, using my background as a businessman, CPA, to see whether or not I can make a difference on that. Certainly, I believe that we've got to give economic aid to Israel and support turning these loans into grants for the time being because of the severe problems that Israel's having with its economy. But it has to also be asked to do something for itself, and it has been. And I know there is an austerity program right now where they're trying to decrease the dependency of the population there on the government, because there's a lot of social welfare that goes on in Israel as well. So I believe that we've got to consistently be there to help Israel be strong because of where it is. And I believe Israel's security there is our security. And I think the way that I'm going to make my contribution to it is trying to understand how we can bolster Israel's economy. Going to another side of the world, we talk about Northern Ireland. And as you know, Prime Minister Thatcher was there as one of the ones that signed a letter, along with Mario Biaggi, to her, that we wanted her to address the issue in Northern Ireland. It's basically much like the refuseniks and the Soviet Jews, and I'm very much involved in that too. It's a human rights, civil rights situation. There's tremendous discrimination in Northern Ireland against the minority population, and we've got to do what we can to see how we can make it better. For instance, we have contracts with companies there. I think one company is short. And what I think we have to do is make sure that we impose our moral standards so that that company provides jobs to both the, I guess, Catholics and Protestants there, and not just one or the other. So there are things that we can do. But I think also a group of us made our points with the Prime Minister by making statements in the press that we want her to pay closer attention to the problem, and that maybe the problem is that we're never going to have a unified Ireland as long as there's an English presence there. So I think that's something that the President should pay more attention to. Other than that, I think the whole issue of terrorism, whether it's in Northern Ireland, I just cannot agree with terrorism in any way. When you have the terrorism that we see around the world, we've got to be constantly vigilant. We can never compromise terrorism. We have to do what we can to uproot it, no matter where it is.
Okay. Before we forget, some of the people may not be familiar with where your new office is located. You give us the address and the phone number.
Yes, it's we opened up just 2 weeks ago in White Plains. I still don't have all my furniture, trials and travails of a new congressman, but we're in 1 North Broadway in White Plains, and the number there is 997-6440. We wanted our first location to be a central location, and we felt White Plains, and it's very accessible with mass transportation. The buses come there, it's going to work out very well. My other office is in the Longworth building in Washington, and I can be reached at either place. I'm commuting. I leave on a plane usually Monday nights or Tuesday mornings, and I return Thursday nights. So I balance my time between the district and its constituent service problems and the legislative agenda in Washington, and it's been a great challenge.
And I see even here before taping the show, you were telling them about phone calls and everything. They don't give you 1 minute to relax, do they?
Most people don't realize that because congressmen change, when congressmen change, a lot of changes have to go on because the leases terminate, people are usually furloughed, and the files are then sent away for reasons pertaining to privileged information. So a new congressman, particularly when the switches from one party to the other, has to start literally from scratch. But that doesn't stop the phones from ringing and the letters from coming because the public still has problems finding Social Security checks, Veterans Administration, Treasury refunds, and that's what a congressman's office is for. Because when I get on the phone on an issue and call one of those agencies, we get an immediate response. And I want to encourage anyone who has a problem with a federal agency to look to us. We've got a very experienced group of caseworkers here in White Plains. As you know, I took 2 caseworkers from Ottinger's staff, 2 from Perone's former staff, and I have now someone that's just joined me from Up County in Pleasantville, so I've got a good dispersion geographically among parties, but everyone is competent.
So you're full of cases.
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to switch back to the domestic scene now in the district. One of the things that keeps cropping up again is the women's rights issues, the abortion issue. There has been, well, more than speculation that the right to life people feel that they may be strong enough to try to get to overturn the law. I forget the exact law. Do you remember Wade versus
Roe
versus Wade? Right. So that women will not be able to have legal abortions. How do you feel about this?
Well, you know, my stance during the campaign, based on my own moral heritage, I don't see this as a religious issue. I see this as a moral one, that I'm against abortion. I'm against the federal funding of abortion. Now, you know, what do? I did not campaign on the right to life line. I didn't feel that I should make the election a referendum on the abortion issue. I feel that it's bad law, but I think what I'd like to see is the Supreme Court readdress it. My concern is this. We hear about whether or not we're talking about life, and that's the basic issue here. Are we talking about human life? Certainly, if you were convinced we're talking about human life, no matter what your position on it was, you'd think very carefully before you would destroy it. But we're in a situation now where it's like going hunting in the forest, and off in the distance you see something move and you think it's a deer, but you're not sure. It may be a person. Would you shoot? Probably not. You'd get closer to the situation to find out that it was a deer, and then you might, if you were hunting, not that I agree with hunting, but you would shoot. I feel the same way here. We're in a situation where millions of children or potential children in the womb are being killed, and the question has not been resolved, you know, to the satisfaction of most people. So I think that at the least we should be exploring this before we have all these, you know, abortion on convenience. Now, does that say that we should have abortions under every circumstance? I mean, would I be against abortion under any circumstance? No. I think that certainly where the life of the mother is at stake, we have to obviously have an exception there. And now you're seeing more and more talk about looking at the rape and incest situations, where, you know, there may be exceptions that have to be considered. And why, you know, the rape and incest usually comes up, and it becomes the position on the other side to say, hey, look what we're doing here. But there's so few instances of rape and incest, and I'd say for those few we ought to look very carefully at them. But can we justify abortion on convenience, I think, is the issue here. It's not an issue that's going to be dealt with easily at the congressional level, I can tell you that.
It never is.
And I think that the Supreme Court, if anything, will have to review that issue.
One of the things that was interesting is, I don't know if you saw it, it was on C-SPAN, Reverend Jerry Falwell and Ted Kennedy had an interesting debate. And Reverend Falwell brought up the point that he felt that if you're going to advocate the right to life, that the right to life groups should adhere to the responsibility of finding homes for those babies if the mothers could not. And that's part of the reason why people are, you know, may not concur with the right to life view. is that feasible economically? And also, if you look at the hardcore statistics, when you take away the theology, the philosophy of it, so to speak, the middle income and higher women are going to do what they want to do anyway because they have the means. It's basically the lower economic people that are going to be, you know, I mean, do you think that this law is really going to affect the decisions of middle income and higher women?
You know, we're talking about
economics?
issues that we could spend a day on here, and it's difficult to put a price tag on. No one should put a price tag on life, and that's, I think, the key issue. In terms of the debate between Kennedy and Falwell, I didn't see that debate, but what was the point that was just made?
That the right to life is, if they want their view to be adhered to,
Yeah.
they have to have the responsibility
There's no doubt.
of finding homes for
There's no
those
doubt. There are
babies.
people today that want children and can't have them. So there's got to be a better job done on the alternatives to abortion. And, you know, there are groups like Birthright, I believe, in the Catholic Church that are trying to work with the pregnant, the mothers to see what those alternatives are. And I think we've got to do more to get into that.
Joe, just quickly, we have to end, but just before we do, let's have your phone number and address again of the district office.
1 North Broadway in White Plains, and the number is 997-6440.
Thank you very much for coming on Westchester
Nice to be
Dateline
here.
again, and good luck to you in
Thank you.
Congress. My guest has been Congressman Joe DioGuardi from the 20th CD. This is Dennis Rudin for Westchester Dateline. Good evening.